the subcommittee's last oversight hearing on WMATA, the events of the past month have obviously necessitated the need for this panel to reassess and explore a host of issues relating to WMATA's services and operations, which are indispensable to the region and to the federal government. While today's hearing certainly won't bring a final resolution as to the cause or leading factors of the recent accident, given the various ongoing investigations, the hearing is meant to continue the dialogue between WMATA and its regional partners and the various federal government oversight entities on the specific issue of system safety, and to learn what is being done now to prevent, as best as possible, another fatal accident from occurring in the future. I'd like to thank today's witnesses for joining us as we discuss this important matter. I look forward to your testimony. And I now yield to our ranking member, Jason Chaffetz, the gentleman from Utah, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lynch. I appreciate you holding this hearing and participation today. On April 29th, we held an oversight hearing on the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. At that hearing, we examined Metro's financial condition and internal controls, along with safety and security issues. On June 22, 2009, a tragic accident, the most serious in Metro's history, occurred on the Red Line. One train crashed into the back of another, killing 9 and injuring 80. In addition to the dead and injured, damage to the morale of Metro's riders and its workers, and to Metro's reputation as a whole, is ongoing. A recent Washington Post editorial commented on the crash as having, quote, shattered many riders' assumptions about the safety of the system, end quote. Today's oversight hearing will examine that accident and continuing challenges faced by Metro. Metro appears to be in the throes of an epic crisis. As a member of Congress and as a Metro user myself, I'm very concerned about the direction. Even before the catastrophe of June 22nd, a Washington Post story described comments from the Metro riders as revealing, quote, a band of beaten down and frustrated people who, despite their close kinship with Metro, have had about enough, end quote. In the wake of the June 22nd crash, a more recent story reflected growing concerns about extensively cramped conditions, long commutes, jerky rides, abrupt stops, and passengers waiting for more than 3 full trains to pass before boarding. There is also evidence of nerves rubbed raw and some reports of yelling and shoving along the way. While investigations are continuing, there are deeply disturbing reports of track circuit problems which should have been anticipated and which have been dealt with in other systems, notably the Bay Area Rapid Transit System in San Francisco. Metro apparently never installed a backup system that is used by BART. A significant segment of the federal workforce relies on the Metro, plus millions of visitors each year. We are also quite aware of the enhanced security issues which apply to the Metro because it services the Washington region. The last Congress approved a measure sponsored by the former chairman of our committee, Tom Davis, who I'm pleased to see as one of our witnesses today. That law authorizes much-needed funds and mandates management assistance, but follow-through by the administration of this Congress is required to make that law a reality. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today, and let me just say on a personal note, a heartfelt thoughts and prayers with those who were injured and killed on the Metro. It's devastating anytime you see that. I think that's the importance of the hearing today. I look forward to the participation here. We want to make sure that we're implementing the best practices. I think individually, let's break it up. Everybody's heart's in the right direction. But if the management's not there to coordinate and move it forward in a cohesive manner, I think that's where this committee needs to be involved. I have my Metro card. I like riding it. I enjoy it. But there are also challenges. There are times and things and frustrations that I think are appropriate for us to dive into. And so, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding this hearing. I look forward to the dialogue from hearing from our witnesses and better understanding what's happening or what's not happening with the Metro today. And with that, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Before we continue with opening statements, I would invite our first panel to come forward and be seated. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to once again thank Chairman Stephen Lynch for his attention to Metro by responding to my request early in his tenure as the new chair of this subcommittee, with a hearing on April 24th and again today, granting my request for this hearing in light of the June 22nd Metro tragedy. I had spoken with the appropriate Metro and National Transportation Safety Board officials concerning this hearing before the investigation is completed and learned that it is not unusual to be asked to testify before an investigation is fully completed. The investigation of this collision may require well in excess of a year or even more. Following our hearing in April, we had every reason to believe that the Metro system was a safe system, and because of the consistent oversight of this subcommittee, I continue to believe that the system that serves this region and millions of visitors is safe. I would not hesitate to board a Metro train even after the tragedy of June 22nd. However, the public is not fully aware of what this subcommittee has learned during years of consistent oversight about the overall safety of the system, and in any case, the public deserves to know much more about this recent catastrophe. It is fair for riders to seek reassurance now, or to know whether there is reason to be concerned about the daily trip on a Metro train. The public has bits and pieces of information about what may have caused the accident and what is being done now to assure its safety. Today's hearing, however, will make public all that is known now as Congress opens its own investigation and will allow the public to separate urban legend from authoritative facts and eyewitness testimony. Long before the June 22nd accident, the regional congressional delegation had been working to secure funds for Metro for capital costs, such as replacement of Metro trains, burdened by increasing numbers of federal and congressional employees, among others, actually subsidized by the federal government in order to encourage employees to take Metro, who form the majority of Metro's weekday employees. Today, the region is particularly grateful to Transportation House Urban Development Appropriations Chair John Alver for finding the funds in his appropriation for the first $150 million installment in the $1.5 billion Congress authorized for a 10-year period. Regrettably, despite our efforts over several years, funding was not authorized until 2008 when control changed in the Congress. But we particularly appreciate the efforts of the former chair of the full committee, Tom Davis, who started us down the road to today's funding, and we are happy to have testified today. The funds, the necessary funds, also were not included in the President's budget, despite constant urging from the regional delegation. But Chairman Alver found the funds to meet this year's commitment, and I know that millions of public and private employees and residents are deeply grateful to him and to the subcommittee. I have just come, Mr. Chairman, for managing a floor resolution recognizing those who were injured and remembering residents we lost in this tragedy. 7 from the District of Columbia, 1 from Maryland, and another from Virginia. We do not have a response that can console the losses of the victims and their families and those who were injured. However, we can begin with today's hearing and the first appropriation for Metro under our bill to demonstrate to all the families, friends, and associates, and to current riders that this tragedy has already had immediate effects for assuring the safety of our transportation system. May I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your consistent attention to this system.
I thank the gentlelady. I would now like to ask unanimous consent to allow Mr. Micah from Florida, who I am told was a past chairman of this subcommittee, to allow him to join the panel and in today's discussion as well. Hearing no objections, so ordered. And at this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Micah from Florida for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and thank you for yielding. And while I'm on the full committee, I'm no longer a member of the subcommittee. And pleased to be here to discuss an important topic. I also am the Republican ranking member of the full Transportation Infrastructure Committee. Ms. Norton and I also serve on that committee together. In that capacity, I did want to make some remarks. And first of all, I want to join others in expressing our sympathy to those that lost loved ones in the tragedy of the Metro crash. We don't know all of the details. I know NTSB is investigating, but again, our heartfelt sympathy to those who lost loved ones and or had family members injured in that tragedy. And it is our important responsibility of this subcommittee, that investigative committee of Congress, and I applaud you for holding this hearing. I think it's very important, not just the Transportation Committee, but our investigative committee take action like you're doing here today. It has been reported that the automatic train control system failed to detect a train waiting on the tracks. If the system had been working properly, possibly, again, the crash could have been avoided. NTSB will really investigate the crash and let us know. However, we do know that other transit systems around the country rely on automatic train control systems, including San Francisco, Boston, Baltimore, Atlanta, Philadelphia, and in my state, Miami. Last year, Congress and a lot of us worked on it together. We passed an Amtrak rail passenger rail safety bill. And in that legislation, Congress required that within the next 6 years, commuter rail trains, intercity passenger trains, and freight trains carrying hazardous materials install similar positive train control systems. We have to learn lessons from tragedies like the one we've experienced here in the Washington community for rail safety around the country. I do want to note for the record that 3 years ago, the Highway and Transit Subcommittee held an oversight hearing on transit safety. And at that hearing, the Government Accountability Office made a number of findings and argued for a more robust safety oversight program. Unlike aviation, railroads, including commuter railroads, transit safety oversight is handled at the local level by state safety oversight agencies. This is because the Federal Transit Administration is a grant-making agency. It's not a regulatory body. Each rail transit system is different and has unique system specifications. The transit agency develops a system safety plan for each transit system, and the state safety oversight agency directly oversees the safety of the transit system by reviewing safety plans, performing audits, and investigating accidents. Some of you may not know this, but FTA currently does not permit expenditure of funds to support those safety offices and officers who have that responsibility. I'm sending, and I have some members have already joined me in sending this letter to the FTA administrator today, and it's as follows. Let me paraphrase it here. We understand that the Federal Transit Administration administrative policy prohibits transit agencies from using their federal grant dollars to support expenses of the state safety offices that directly oversee the safety of transit systems. Again, according to a GAO report from our committee, these state safety offices are often inadequately funded and staffed. I think in Washington Metro, up to about a year ago, they had about one position. Now they have two. And again, they're prohibited from taking these federal dollars, and it's not by law, it's by policy. However, given what occurred last year with I guess, the Boston Green Line and also with the Washington Metro system recently, we feel it's important that these safety offices be strengthened. So we recommend in this letter here that the Federal Transit Administration work with us to provide those agencies, the flexibility to utilize some of the dollars, maybe a small percentage, for some of these important positions. So I'll be asking other members to sign this and send this. And I think that the final concern that I have here, members, is that Mr. Oberstar and I have been trying to get a major highway and transit bill passed. The current one we operate under expires in just a few months at the end of September. The administration's now said that while we're in the process of drafting this, they sort of dropped a bomb on us and said, let's extend this for 18 months. What will happen is all of these safety projects, all of our transportation projects, our major transit projects, and major highway and infrastructure projects will be put on hold for 2 years. And if we wanted to mandate changes by law, we would have a tough time doing it. So I urge everyone to work with Mr. Oberstar and myself to try to move that legislation forward. Urge members to sign this letter, because we don't need legislation to get FTA to do what they should be doing, is allowing more flexibility and use of these federal funds for safety oversight purposes. Thank you so much for the courtesy extended me, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman like to have the letter entered into the record?
I would, and appreciate it, and I will also ask other members to sign. We've got some signatures here. Thank you so much. I ask unanimous consent.
Okay. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman's letter be entered into the record. Without objection, so ordered. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I ask unanimous consent that my full opening statement be placed in the record. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. We're honored today, as Congresswoman Norton said, to have Mr. Davis here. Mr. Davis, when he was Chairman Davis, championed the Metro system and continued to do so until his departure last year. If, as I will predict, Congressman Davis would rightfully so say, if you can't get it right in D.C., you can't get it right in public train around the country. There's a proposal in the stimulus package just passed a few months ago to put a maglift type of train, a high-speed 200-mile-an-hour train between Orange County and Las Vegas. It's pretty clear that we have fundamental problems with going 59 miles an hour with absolute safety in Washington, D.C. Here today we're going to hear about how the accident happened, how it won't happen again, but more importantly, I think this is an opportunity for us to look at a 30-plus-year-old system since 1973, when the whole Metro system began being rolled together, and say, have we done all that we can do? I know that Chairman Davis did all he could do on his watch, but I do believe that Washington, D.C., a compact city with a large ridership that comes into federal systems or in and around the city every day, commuters who, by both their own choice and by incentives from the federal government, essentially in most cases free passes, want to use this system and want it to be 100% safe and 100% reliable. Mr. Chairman, I believe that we as a committee have a special obligation to look at this system, but I believe that what we get right in this system, including the full funding of all the safety requirements, in fact, is essential for all systems around the country. And I, like many people, everyone has a solution when they come after a tragedy like this. I might strongly suggest to this committee that we bear in mind that there are billions of unspent stimulus dollars that are in fact earmarked for train transportation that will not be spent in the near future and might very well still be redirectable to meet the needs of getting the Metro system both safe and reliable at the level that we believed we were at and believe we should be at. I look forward to hearing our panel, and I thank the Chairman for holding this important hearing, and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Before we swear our witnesses, I want to ask if Mr. Tewitt is here. Come forward. Mr. Tewitt was an eyewitness on the day of the accident. We will entertain him when he does arrive. It is the custom in this subcommittee to swear witnesses who are to testify. May I ask you all to stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that your testimony before this subcommittee here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that all of the witnesses have answered in the affirmative, with the absence of Mr. Tewitt, who will be sworn when he arrives. And your entire statement will be included in the record. Mr. Davis, I'm sure you don't need to be instructed in this matter, but the green light indicates that each witness has 5 minutes to summarize your statement. The yellow light means you have 1 minute remaining to complete your statement, and the red light indicates that your time for speaking has expired. I'd like to, originally I had offered the courtesy to Mr. Conley to introduce Mr. Davis, and here he is. Perfect.
Jerry, you're just a little late. We were just about to give your seat away.
Gentleman is right on time, as always. The chair would now like to recognize the gentleman from Northern Virginia, Mr. Conley, for the purposes of introducing Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, as ever, for your graciousness. It's a great privilege for me to sit up here and welcome back to this committee our distinguished former chairman, Tom Davis. Tom Davis and I have followed in each other's footsteps. He was a longtime member of the Board of Supervisors of Fairfax County, then became the chairman of Fairfax County, and then took this congressional seat. I also was a longtime member of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, succeeded Tom as chairman, and then, of course, succeeded him in this seat. Tom has been a friend and a mentor. He has shown bipartisan inclinations that are deeply appreciated. And I want to say personally, in my transition to this job, Tom Davis could not have been more gracious and more generous, he and his staff. And I just want to thank him and thank him for his leadership in Metro. Without Tom's vision, this Congress would never have come up with the idea of a $150 million matching grant to the localities putting up capital money for Metro. As the tragedy of June 22nd underscored, Metro is starved for capital investment. And the federal government bears some responsibility, as do the localities, in trying to address that investment shortage. And again, I salute my predecessor, Tom Davis, for his understanding of that issue, his vision for what had to be done, and his willingness to make sure that this Congress lived up to that obligation. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Representative Conley, and your continued commitment to public service. Fought a lot of battles, usually together, not always, as local politics go. Chairman Lynch, thank you for calling this hearing. It's timely, it's important. Let me thank Mrs. Norton, Mr. Issa, who helped us pass this legislation first in 06 and then in 08, when we finally got it to the Senate and into law. And to Ranking Member Shaver, it's nice to see you again, and thank you for your leadership as well. We saw early on with GAO reports that the Metro has a $6 billion shortfall in terms of its capital funding need. And there was no way that this could have been raised within the existing system. Fares would not have supported it. So the legislation simply bit off part of that, $3 billion, $1.5 billion paid for by the federal government in over 10 years, $1.5 in matching funds, dedicated matching funds from localities. Prior to the legislation, there was no dedicated funding. Metro got what it got on an annual basis, and when local governments cut their budget, Metro suffered as a result. This has put, I think, a needed discipline on local governments to get the match, and I was just thrilled to hear that Chairman Oliver put in the $150 million last night in the Transportation Appropriation Bill. This is a precedent for the next 10 years that I think will go a long way toward making the Metro system safer and stronger. I also want to offer my condolences to the friends and the families of the 9 Metro passengers who tragically lost in last month's crash, and for their injury, for those that are injured, I wish them a speedy recovery. You know, as policymakers, like it or not, we bear some responsibility in funding and some of the shortfalls the system has had over time. And I think, if anything else, we want to learn from this. We don't want this to happen again. So let me go briefly over what the legislation called for and what remains to be done, and how we can continue to make this a safer and a better system here in the nation's subway system. First of all, the Congress last night put in $150 million for the fiscal year. The localities have already come up with their match. An independent IG was established under the legislation so that Metro wouldn't be looking at itself. You'd have an independent inspector general, which we think helps their operations and keeps them on their toes, something that I think was overdue. Metro actually, we introduced the legislation. Metro actually acted on their own to establish this, but the legislation mandates it. Finally, federal representation on the Metro Board was an important concept, and that has not taken place yet. It hasn't taken place because Congress has not adopted the changes to the Metro Compact. Representative Hoyer has pending legislation that will do that. All 3 of the states have amended the Metro Compact through their state legislatures and city councils. Now the federal government has to do that, and I think the quicker the possible so that the President can appoint 2 federal members to the Metro Board. Now, why is this important? It's important because although Virginia and Maryland and the district have representatives on the subway system, the natural tendency, and I've been in local government for 15 years before I came here, is to be rather provincial in terms of how you look at the system. Is it good for Maryland? Is it good for Virginia? Is it good for stations in my district? Having that federal representation on there, that federal expertise, I think will add a level, if you will, of maturity and a level of analysis that I think will be helpful to this system. The President's got to make good appointees, but I think I think we can count on them to do that. So that has to happen as well. The legislation also expanded wireless service on the Metro system. Prior to this, it was reserved for one operator. This expands it. We think this is helpful, particularly in cases of accidents and crime. Finally, let me say that I think the NTSB has identified some improvements that need to be worked on immediately through the signaling system, monitoring and tracking systems. I think there is stimulus money available. It would be helpful if the Congress pushed to get a slug of money up there, right there, to make these changes right away so that the kind of tragedy that happened on June 22nd will not happen again, and we can make those changes. Other than that, I want to thank the members up here in the House for being so supportive of Metro over the years. It was the Senate that held the legislation up for 4 years, and you all have been great to work with. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and I want to add to Mr. Connolly's remarks about you, Mr. Davis, and how, as chairman of this committee, you were very fair and bipartisan and provided a great example, I think, of strong leadership in the Congress during your time here. At this point, I would like to introduce Ms. Jackie Jeter. She is the president of the Amalgamated Transit Union Local 689. Ms. Jeter began her career with the Transit Authority as a part-time bus operator in 1979 and has worked as a full-time bus operator, train operator, and interlocking operator. Ms. Jeter is a member of today's Women's Caucus of Local 689 and has the distinction of being the first female assistant business agent of Local 689. And I also want to express my heartfelt sympathies for you and your members. I know you lost a valued member of your local union, Local 689, in Janice McMillan on the day of this accident, and we understand that her conduct at the time of this accident in slowing the train down may have saved lives in terms of her own action here. But again, we thank you for your attendance here, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, it is my honor to serve as a witness before you today. As a rail operator of 22 years and as president of the Amalgamated Transit Union, Local 689, I am deeply and personally affected by the tragic WMATA rail accident of June 22nd. I join my union members and others to urge swift corrective actions. We stand ready to help find solutions that improvements and technological advancements capable of addressing the problems of the aging WMATA rail system. I firmly believe that we cannot afford to spend time on expensive studies and multiple meetings, but must instead move into implementation mode without further delay. When the National Transportation Safety Board's report from its investigation into the June 22nd accident is in hand, we will have a much better idea of what went wrong and how to resolve those problems. I urge the committee to be cautious about drawing any conclusions from this hearing. I believe that it would be premature to publicly conjecture about the causes of the crash. I also call on WMATA and the NTSB to be transparent in their investigation for the sake of the workers, the public, and policymakers. Local 689's motto is "We Make It Work." Janice McMillan, the operator killed in the crash, embodied that spirit. Her actions epitomized the heroism sometimes required of our members. Safety is the #1 priority of Local 689. It is what we work hard to deliver every day to every rider on the buses and trains. As president of the Workers' Union, one of my primary goals is to ensure that every worker receives appropriate safety measures and training from WMATA. While we do not yet know the exact causes of the accident, there were troubling patterns of WMATA's responses to previous NTSB recommendations. Since the first fatal accident on WMATA in 1982, the NTSB has recommended installing car-borne monitors in every WMATA car to provide advanced performance data for every department. None of the 1,000 series cars in the systems are so equipped, including those involved in the accident. After the 1996 Shady Grove accident, the NTSB recommended WMATA evaluate all series of Metrorail cars with respect to resisting car body telescoping and providing better passenger protection, and make the necessary modifications. After the 2004 Woodley Park accident, the NTSB made a specific recommendation to either retire or retrofit the Roar-built 1,000 series cars based on their crashworthiness. WMATA again failed to comply with these recommendations, citing costs and binding lease agreements through 2014. The NTSB made an urgent recommendation to include specific instructions when responding to rollback situations, and WMATA responded that it would not address the issue. The recommendation was left as open, unacceptable response in the NTSB reports. It is unfortunate that the NTSB can do little more than make recommendations based on these findings. It has no power as an agency to enforce any of its own suggestions. Furthermore, there is no independent body to oversight of WMATA other than Congress. Over the years, Local 689's leadership has continually made suggestions to WMATA for procedural and equipment changes. WMATA is allowed to choose, ignore, defer recommendations until it deems the time ripe for implementation. Safety should not fall victim to fiscal constraints or internal priorities. Any legislation for the WMATA system should include regulations, enforcement, and oversight. WMATA is heavily constrained by its funding, and I see that my time is running out. And I believe that funding is important for WMATA. We need dollars. It's an aging infrastructure, and in order to make that infrastructure work for the members of Local 689 and all of the employees of WMATA, we have to put the money where this nation wants it. If public transportation is something that we need, and we sorely need it, based on the economy itself, it's been proven that public transportation is needed, then we need to put the dollars where it is needed. And I thank you so much for this opportunity.
I thank the gentlelady. Our next witness is Mr. William Millar, who joined the American Public Transportation Association in 1996 and has worked to increase federal investments in public transportation. From 1973 to 1977, Mr. Millar worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, where he created Pennsylvania's free transit program for senior citizens. Mr. Millar also spent 13 years as the executive director at the Port Authority of Allegheny County. Mr. Millar, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank you for holding these hearings today, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here on behalf of the public transportation industry. You know, when a terrible tragedy such as the one that is the subject of this hearing occurs, all of us certainly feel a great loss. We feel certainly great sympathy, and our prayers and our sympathies go out to the victims, to their families, to their loved ones. It is a tragedy like this that causes us to take a step back, to examine what we do, to see how we might improve the way we do things in order to prevent these types of accidents from happening. As others have already said, we do not yet know the exact causes, but that shouldn't stop us from taking prudent steps to move forward. And I know later in this hearing you'll hear testimony from WMATA and others about steps that are being taken. Our association stands ready to support WMATA, this committee, and any other bodies involved here in trying to make our systems safer. Now, notwithstanding the terrible tragedy we're discussing today, Americans are using public transportation in modern record numbers. There are many reasons why Americans are using public transit, but there's one undeniable common thread. Tens of millions of customers rely on public transportation every day because our systems are fundamentally safe. But as this terrible tragedy demonstrates, they can always and must be made safer. Years of proven performance records have instilled a confidence in the riding public that our systems will transport them safely. I continue to use Metrorail for my commute on a daily basis because it is a safe system and because the alternatives are much less safe. The U.S. Department of Transportation data shows that a person is 29 times safer when using heavy rail public transportation such as WMATA operates rather than taking the same trip in an automobile. Further, the congressionally created National Surface Transportation Revenue and Policy Study Commission indicated that highway travel accounts for over 94% of all fatalities and then 99% of all injuries on the nation's surface transportation system. This data clearly indicates that the public's trust in public transportation is not misplaced. Public transit is one of the safest modes of transportation available. But numbers and statistics aside, nothing is infallible. Therefore, APTA and its members remain vigilant in continuing our commitment to advancing transit safety and promoting the safe operation of rail transit systems. I've been asked to comment on several areas by the committee regarding safety standards and procedures in the industry. Please note I'm not speaking of WMATA specifically, but rather presenting information generally about the industry, much of which would be applicable to WMATA. For decades, we've been the leading force in developing safety programs and standards for public transportation operations, maintenance, and procurement. In the 1980s, APTA was asked by the rail transit industry and FTA's predecessor, the Urban Mass Transportation Administration, to develop a standardized program for rail transit safety, which we established under the auspices of what was then known as the Rail Safety Review Board. APTA's commitment to safety was also the basis for our standards development program initiated in 1996, which currently includes standards for rail transit, commuter rail, bus operations, procurement, intelligent communications interface, and security. Our organization has been designated as a standards development organization, shorthand SDO, by the U.S. Department of Transportation and is funded in part through grants from the Federal Transit Administration. Congress has also officially recognized the importance of promoting voluntary industry-based standards as a way of creating uniformity within the legal and regulatory structure of the United States. My written testimony contains much more detail on the nature of these standards, the process that is used, and things of that sort. I do think it's important to realize we don't rely just on our own members or our own expertise. We involve many other organizations, such as the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the American Railway Engineering and Maintenance Association, and a host of others, as well as working with the Federal Transit Administration, the Federal Railroad Administration, the National Transportation Safety Board, and others in developing these standards. To date, we've published over 170 rail standards in categories applicable to heavy rail transit, and such as those used by WMATA. Heavy rail crashworthiness standard developed by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in collaboration with APTA is a good example, developed after some 5 years of work at the professional level. Now, there's much more in my written comments. I appreciate I've exhausted my time here, and I would certainly look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you, sir.
I thank the gentleman. I now yield myself 5 minutes. Let me just say that I know there are 4 or 5 federal agencies that have shared responsibility here, and this has resulted in an inordinate amount of acronyms being used at this hearing. So I would just caution people to, at least before you use the acronym, just describe the full title of whatever that is you're referring to. And for those listening or watching at home, WMATA stands for Washington Metro Area Transit Authority, and so you'll hear that constantly referred to. WMATA is the Metro, easier to understand it in that sense. Let me ask, Ms. Jeter, you're in a unique position, I think, and I know we were introduced previously by Steve McDougall, who's the president of Local 589 in the Boston area.
That's
and
correct.
We've had situations on the T in Boston with train collisions.
Yes.
Now, I understand where we are on the Metro, and I'm a rider as well. I'm a commuter. I don't have a car down here, so I find myself on the Metro quite a bit. But there are 2 systems, and one is to have a manual operating system where the conductor actually operates the train manually, and then there's an automated system that is used. As I understand the circumstances of the most recent accident, Train 214, which was the first train in line, was being operated manually by that conductor, while the one that Ms. McMillan was operating, hers was on automatic.
Yes.
And the way it should have worked was that Ms. McWilliams' train 112 should have detected the train in front of her and should have automatically stopped the train or slowed it down. And as I understand it, she visually made a report that there was a train ahead, and that so all the indications were that she recognized the threat, but that mechanically the system did not work and it failed. Where you have this seeming conflict, and I'm not sure why the first train was manually operated. Maybe that was a decision by the conductor in that case. I understand those signals weren't operating in that area, or they were operating intermittently in that area. It may have been a decision on the part of the conductor just to switch to manual operation. I'm not sure. But where you have this conflict, is there a way to safely resolve that? Or what are your own observations, having been in the seat yourself and being very, very familiar with the circumstances for your conductors, for your employees? How best might we resolve that conflict between manual operation and automatic operation?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that, first of all, let me say that under no circumstances, whether the train was in manual or in ATO, should it have happened. Safeguards are in place to protect that kind of accident from occurring whether you are in manual or in automatic. I think that the operators are trained to know when it's best for them to move up in a manual or switch from automatic to manual. And also from my experience and history as being an operator, I've also seen where all you should have to do is let Central know that you've encountered a problem. And once you've let them know that you've encountered the problem, they know that manual operation is needed. I believe in the system. I believe in it wholeheartedly. I, like you, believe that it is a safe system, although it should be safer at this point. But I do know that under no, and I hope I answered your question, because under no circumstances should it have occurred, period.
I thank you, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Chaffetz from Utah, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman Davis, if you could expand a little bit about the kind of a two-part question about the funding itself. What would happen if the funding were not to go forward from your perspective in history? And then the second part of that question is the funding alone going to solve the problem? Or are there other challenges that you see above and beyond just the funding, lack of funding?
As you know, money doesn't always solve problems by itself. That's why we put the independent IG into this legislation and federal representation. We thought all of these would enhance oversight over the system to help it being spent, correctly along the way. The history of this is it came under the old District of Columbia Committee. Every other